Do you guys remember way back in the day, i.e. like 3 to 4 months ago, when it was a common consensus that if you were laying on top of your opponent in the UFC, it didn't matter what was happening, you were winning. The person on bottom could be hammering you with elbows, but as long as you were laying on top of them, you were basically 10-7ing them. Now, the crazy thing about this was, back then, in the judging criteria, it was spelled out clear as day that control time actually ranked pretty low on what the judges were meant to look at when deciding who was winning each round. But even the commentators were completely unaware of the judging criteria because they all, and when I say commentators, I mean Daniel Cormier. That is who I'm always talking about. As you guys all know, I hate Daniel Cormier. Every commentator was guilty of this, but Daniel Cormier was the most egregious because, as you guys know, he's a wrestler and he has a very deep bias to whoever is on top. He does not care what is going on. Well, as many of you know, I'm sure, they actually just released a new judging criteria with new rules. And thank goodness, since this is big news that they've changed up judging, they've changed up some rules, now all the commentators are deciding to actually get educated and read this stuff. So now they finally understand what it takes to win a mixed martial arts fight. And just like it was before, the number one criteria is damage. The only significant change here is that everyone is now just aware of what the criteria is. And thank God DC is now actually starting to call these fights correctly. Now, what's really interesting about this is now that everyone's aware of the judging criteria and how important damage is, we're starting to see some new strategies being used. And this change is primarily how fighters attack from their back in guard. Now, this has always worked, but fighters rarely used it because in their minds it was pointless. They're losing the fight being on their backs. But now the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter where you are in the fight as long as you're causing damage. And what I think a lot of people don't realize, it's actually a lot easier said than done to really damage your opponent from the top. This was highlighted really well this past weekend when Alexa Grasso fought Valentina Shevchenko. Now, when you're on the top in full guard, you can generate more power than the person on their backs, but it gets difficult to land strikes cleanly because you have to be basically chest to chest in full guard. And the reason for that is, the second you try to posture up, the person on bottom is just going to get their legs in between you, and now all of a sudden, they can hit you from a place you can't hit them. You see right here, Valentina takes Grasso down, and she's chest to chest. Now, she lands a couple of decent hard shots from here, but it's really hard to just unload and do a lot of damage. And Grasso has one arm hooked and is just constantly pestering with short punches. Now, the second Valentina tries to posture up to really land punches, this happens immediately.
Yeah, that knockdown's the round, at least right now, under 90 seconds to go. Ooh, that's a kick from Grasso.
Now, obviously, there's a pretty big skill gap when it comes to fighting off your back like this. It's not easy to do, but when you have someone who is really elite from guard, it's difficult to fight against. Look at Charles Olivera versus Beneil Dariush. Now, in this instance, Dariush was actually posturing up quite a bit, but Olivera wasn't even attempting to kick him away. He was just letting him throw strikes from there. And Charles is catching every single punch on his arms. He's blocking very well and just keeps landing those short shots over and over again. Now, this was just before the new rules came out, so of course, Daniel Cormier is commentating this fight, and he is just raving about how Charles is losing, how this is the biggest mistake of his life, fighting off his back like this. But if you actually try to pay attention to what you're watching, Dariush is getting schooled from on top. He is not causing any damage, and he is getting damaged. And then the second Dariush tries to posture up so he can actually punch correctly, it just gives Olivera the space to start attacking with submissions. Another great example was Gilbert Burns versus Khamzat. Gilbert completely shut down Khamzat's top game, using the knee shield and landing hammer fists from his back. The fight starts. Khamzat immediately shoots. Gilbert causes a scramble. He ends up on his back, but the second he gets there, he immediately slides his knee shield in, starts landing with hammer fists, and Khamzat can't hit him, so he just elects to stand up. Later in the fight, a very similar thing happens. Gilbert shoots, Khamzat sprawls, and Gilbert, instead of just trying to stand back up, goes to his back, keeps his legs in front of Khamzat, puts that knee shield in, and just starts swinging with hammer fists. Khamzat was completely helpless there. He could not hit him. For the longest time in MMA, it seemed like maintaining your guard, keeping your legs in front of your opponent, it wasn't seen to be that important in MMA. The emphasis was much more placed on, well, just stand up. Well, now that we're all aware of what the most important aspect of winning rounds in MMA is, we're going to see fighters utilize the guard very differently.